Hi, we continue in 2 Samuel 20 today as David is on his way back to Jerusalem, and as you can see on the left side of the screen, makes it there right in the verse that we begin with. But at the same time, as you can see on the right side of the screen, just in the previous verses, a so-called son of Belial named Sheba, son of Bichri, a Benjaminite, sounded the trumpet and called out to all the Israelites, "We have no portion in David, no share in the son of Jesse. Everyone to your tents, O Israel." So all the men of Israel went up from David and followed Sheba, son of Bichri, but the men of Judah followed and clung to their king from the Jordan to the Jerusalem. So that's the situation we're facing now, and we might have thought that the peak of the drama in the story was Absalom's rebellion. It certainly took several chapters, from chapter 15 to 18, to play out that scenario. But really, if we look at it objectively, this may well be the greatest threat to David altogether, because now that Absalom is dead, and we saw at the end of chapter 19, all the people of Israel and all the people of Judah facing each other in the presence of the king, arguing about who had a closer relationship with the king, it didn't take much for Sheba in the very next verse to call all Israel back to their tents, and we're told all of them did. So now David has the Judahites with him, but apparently nobody of Israel as he begins his return, as he arrives in Jerusalem and tries to take his reign again. So what we see in the passage we're going to look at today, which on the left side you can see is this unit from verse 3 to verse 7. On the right side, it comes into several pieces of our little chiasm. If I zoom back out, you can see the chiasm that's framed around the blowing the trumpet by Sheba in the beginning, the blowing the trumpet by Joab in the end, the death of Amasa in the B part here, the death of Sheba in the B prime part, and Joab taking over in the middle where it said all the people followed Joab to pursue Sheba. So as I was suggesting at the end of the last video, this chapter could well be called the restoration of Joab following the restoration of David. But Joab will only be restored if David has power, and so that's what we have to see in our scene here. And I'd like to suggest that what we see is a chaotic scene. They arrive back in Jerusalem, but things are going all which way, and David will have several balls in the air, so to speak, to see whether he can get Israel to come back. So in this chaotic scene, let's see how it unfolds. So starting in verse 3 up here, and we see David came to his house in Jerusalem. The king took the 10 concubines, as I often translate the Hebrew Pilgashim as secondary wives. But here I've left it as concubines because plainly these are not secondary wives in the way that, for example, Zilpah and Bilhah were for Jacob in Genesis, where he has children with them and clearly has a relationship with them, and their children become the eponymous ancestors of the named tribes of Israel. But these are all anonymous women who serve only the royal house symbolically, and so they really are, in this sense, concubines. To the extent that's a pejorative term, it applies here. As fuel and gun note in my note below, what the concubines might have wanted or feared appears to have been of no concern to David. He sheds no tears for them, either as left behind by him, violated by his son, or as lifelong prisoners in a widowhood of his making. And I'm not going to focus on that here, but if we really look at how David has treated women, we see he's never treated women very well. I mean, he marries Abigail after her husband Nabal dies, but we never hear about her again. We've not heard about Bathsheba throughout this whole story since chapter 12. We'll hear about her again in the succession when Nathan goes to her and insists that she better speak to David if she wants to stay alive, and Solomon wants to stay alive. But we know that David has many other women too who have fathered, or mothered rather, the various children we've seen named, and we see no relationship with any of them at all. Not just not affection, they're not involved in this at all. So it's a highly patriarchal situation in this monarchical reality where the women are plainly second class. And I really want to highlight that because apart from the question of whether David is honest or deceitful, apart from the character of David, this is really about the character of monarchy. To the extent that some people want to suggest David's a great king, well, great under what criteria? He's a violent patriarch who lies and steals and cheats and murders. And if you want to call that the will of God, well, that's a different God than Jesus embodied and a different God than I personally believe in, but the Bible leaves that open. But in this particular case, we see specifically how he treats the concubines. He locks them in a guardhouse. They are simply symbols. They're not really people for him at all. So let's look at the details here. The king took, doing what kings do, back to 1 Samuel 8, 6 times, take your women, and the 10. And as my note has below, symbolic of the 10 northern tribes who have just left. Just as David captured Saul's grandson, now he captures the symbols of all Israel. Brueggemann, the late wonderful Walter Brueggemann, read this as a conciliatory gesture to bring Israel back into the fold in light of the perception that having concubines suggests, quote, the monarchy has embraced the royal ideology of the Near East, and that may well be the case. Falkman adds, just as the women were unable to safeguard David's house, David has proved unable to preserve the house of Israel. But of course, when he left the women to take care of the house, was he really expecting them to be the guards? Or is he simply expecting them to be there to represent his presence? So I think Falkman may be playing into some of the very sexism of the monarchy here that suggests that the women have somehow failed rather than being manipulated by David. So he put them literally in a guardhouse here. As Polza notes, the fate of those who guard the king's house is lifelong confinement in a guardhouse. As Castor notes, they are effectively punished for succumbing to sexual violence, which is to say that Absalom had the tent put up and went into them under the very sun in front of the very people of Israel, just as Nathan in Yahweh's name had predicted back in 2 Samuel 12. Then he provided for them using the same terms he did for Barzillai, as well as the same thing he did for Mephibosheth. So whether that's captive or caring for can only be determined by context. And the context is he did not go into them, which is to say they were not sexual partners with them, and they were shut up till the day of their death, living as if in widowhood. So it could hardly be more harsh than that these women are being locked in a cell because they symbolize the Israel that has not come back. So whether we follow Brueggemann and think this is meant to be a symbol to bring Israel back, or a symbol to say I'm locking up Israel, you have to decide. But then he shifts. Then he goes to Amasa, who we recall was the general for Absalom that David brought in the midst of the chaos of the return, perhaps to suggest to the people of Israel that he's merciful, that he's not having Amasa killed. And yet, what about Joab? We've been told that Amasa is now in charge of the army, and we've not heard where Joab is. We'll find out about that very soon. So in the New RSV, we hear, call the men of Judah together to me within 3 days and be here yourself. I translated that a little differently. You can see on the right side, cry out to the men of Judah. And that's the word for call out here. It can be as summon, but it literally means to call out, to cry out. So he's supposed to run out into wherever, to the streets of Jerusalem. Judah is obviously larger than Jerusalem, but we saw just in the verse before, as you can see on the left side of the screen, all of Judah followed their king, as we noted, clung to their king. So presumably they're all right there in Jerusalem. So his calling them together doesn't mean that he has to go all around the land of Judah and bring them together. Presumably all the people of Judah are right there in Jerusalem, which is an absurd thing if we take it literally, but at least perhaps the representatives or the people that seem important. We can't imagine that the entire countryside of Judah is all found itself squeezed into the city of Jerusalem. Why does he give him 3 days? It's not clear. Perhaps that's just time for people to adapt. But why would he need all the people of Judah to chase down one person? And one of the questions is, did the people of Israel go to their tents, or are they with Sheba trying to engage in a war against Jerusalem? And we'll have to decide that a little later in the story when we get to the pursuit of Sheba himself. So we hear in verse 5 now. Amasa went to summon Judah, or literally to cry out, following the same language. It's the same word in both places, translated here as call and here to summon, but it's cry out in both cases. So at first it sounds like he's obeying, but then something very mysterious happens, and we have to look really closely at the language of this. He delayed, and it's the infinitive absolute for emphasis, which is to say the doubling, vayahir, vayohar, and there's no explanation. It's left there. Readers have to decide. Is it a question of his loyalty? That he's perhaps really still an Israelite on the side of that. He was roped into this role by David, but does he really want to be there serving David? He was serving Absalom. Keep in mind that he's a cousin of Joab and Abishai, so he's really part of that family. So if he really wants to be on the Israel side, then he's opposing his cousins in what will ensue and what follows. So he delayed, beyond the set time, using hamaed here, a word that's used a number of times throughout, and is curiously provides an ironic inverse of what we hear here, back here in 1 Samuel 13, where Saul waited 7 days for the time appointed by Samuel, but Samuel didn't come, so Saul jumped the gun on that and got in trouble with Samuel, allegedly in the name of Yahweh, as we see down there in verse 13, for violating the set time. But back in 1 Samuel 13, the set time seemed to be arbitrary, seemed to be an exercise of Samuel exerting his authority over the soon-to-be king. Here it seems like the set time is, we better get this together quickly, or Sheba is going to have all Israel gone to their tents and perhaps gone from us for all time, which is exactly what will happen a generation later when Solomon's son Rehoboam hears the same cry, to your tents, O Israel, and they're gone never to return. So he delayed beyond the set time that it had been appointed him. Sher Yadov here, Yad, this form of the word Yad, not the same word as Yad for to know, only here in Samuel. And so 3 days now they've been waiting to see what's going on, and apparently nothing is happening. Why can't David do it himself? Notice how David keeps delegating all this and not doing anything directly. Rather than being the king who leads, he's appointing other people to do his work for him. And he's been doing that throughout this entire section, all the way back since chapter 11, when the time of kings going into battle, and he stayed home, and we know what ensued there with Uriah and Bathsheba. So now he says to Abishai, and I want to note something about Abishai as David goes to him, because it's really important that we remember that up until now, David has had nothing good to say about these people, even though they seem to be doing his will. Back in chapter 3, after the death of Abner at the hand of Joab, Abishai's brother, David said, I am powerless, even though anointed king. These men, the sons of Zeruiah, are too violent for me. And then we saw in chapter 16, when Sheba had his attempt to protest against David by throwing dust and stones at him and cursing him, Abishai offered to take off his head, and the king said, what have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah? Notice not specifically about Abishai, but about the group of them. And then a little later, what we just saw in the previous chapter, when Shammai came back, he asks again, at least not should I take his head off, but the principal question, shouldn't he die today? And David repeats again exactly, what have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah, that you should become an adversary for me? So just recently, just a few verses before, really, David has condemned Abishai as always too ready to die. And yet now he's sending him out there to do precisely this, to presumably to kill Sheba. And the last paragraph you see on the right side is what will happen in 1 Kings, as we've been following around some of the other people that David has encountered in this section. We'll see he will offer deathbed instructions to have both Joab die and to have Abishai. Abishai will already be gone by then, so none of them will survive. Eventually survive. Only Abishai is reported to have survived David's reign or the succession, as we see in 23:18. It'll be Joab who dies there. So he's saying to Abishai, who he knows is a hired assassin, and he's twice said, what have I to do with you people? He says this, now Sheba, son of Bichri, and notice how that naming him is throughout the chapter is a key word. Almost never just Sheba there, but Sheba, son of Bichri, even though we know nothing about who Bichri is, and we'll see something about the Bichrites, presumably their family. We see that down here, but we know nothing about who those people are. So he says, now Sheba, son of Bichri, will do us more harm, literally more evil than Absalom. And that seems to be the case, that Absalom had the charm to lead people, but he was dead, and now Sheba's not proposing to be king. He's just led Israel to leave the monarchy altogether. Absalom was not condemning the monarchy. He just wanted to be king. Sheba's promoting the pre-monarchical life in tents that would have them walk away from Jerusalem and the monarchy altogether. So here's what David says to Abishai. Take your Lord's servants. And that creates an interesting ambiguity here, suggesting that that Abishai still works for Joab. Otherwise, who would be his Lord's servants unless they're David's servants? But why would he speak of himself in the third person? It's usually in deference to the king that other people speak of themselves, or the king in the third person, your servant, speaking of themselves, for example. So this seems to be suggesting that Joab is still his servant, and he's to take Joab's slaves here. And always the word for servant in the New RSV is the Hebrew abed for slave. And pursue him. And that's certainly a key word in these verses, as you can see in the blue here. Pursue, pursue, pursue. Or he will find not fortified cities, fortified simply not in the Hebrew, cities for himself and escape from us. And think about what he's saying there. He's saying there are likely to be cities that will protect Sheba, that will be on his side. And even though Sheba has told Israel to go to their tents, there'll be people who don't live in tents in cities who David assumes would protect Sheba from the king. So there's certainly rebellion in the streets and the tents, and rebellion in the cities as far as he believes. And then escape from us. Literally, a phrase that's hard to render in English to have it make sense, but literally is would cut out and snatch our eyes. So not so much escape, but would prevent them from seeing him, an interesting image in the Hebrew. So then we hear this, Joab's men went after him. And Falconer notes it was Abishai whom David sent out, but Abishai doesn't object to Joab's claim to power, prepares the way for his brother Amasa to die at the hands of Joab. But as I was noting and preparing for this, it doesn't say Joab went out. It says Joab's men went out. And that would make sense of what we just saw in verse 6. Take your Lord's slaves, and that would be Joab's men. So it's not clear that if David's saying, take the people who are Joab's, but leave Joab behind, but it isn't until verse 8 that we hear Joab was actually there. So it's ambiguous in verse 7 whether Joab is part of this, whether Joab is taking over or Joab is doing this separately. That David has ordered Abishai to take your Lord's servants, but perhaps meanwhile Joab's men went after him independent of Abishai and David, seeking to take control. So there's an ambiguity there. They'll have to play out as we go. So he went after him along with the mercenaries, the Cherethites and Pelethites, whom we saw earlier back in chapter 15, leaving when David left, and so now they're back. Notice this is not the people of Judah. This is not the people of Israel who are no longer on David's side, nor is it specifically David's men, as we saw earlier, but the professional warriors. So this is no longer a battle of the people where David is suggesting that these two ethnic groups, Israel and Judah, as ordinary people, would be loyal to him, but professional soldiers here, including all the warriors, the Gibborim here, who we saw earlier in chapter 17, who are also like strong men and warriors. And they went out from Jerusalem to pursue Sheba, son of Bichri. How do they hear about it from so far away? Well, we don't know. We don't know where they are, where Joab was. Last time we saw Joab, he was back down here in Gilgal, or even on the other side. We had not heard him come up to Jerusalem. So we don't know how they got there. Presumably they came back with David, but we had not heard about them since chapter 15. So whether it's just simply silence or whether word passed, we'd have to decide for ourselves. So the wonderful ambiguity of Hebrew. And the way it's written, of course. So one more verse here. When they were at the large stone that is in Gibeon, and we got to look at that a little more closely too. The large stone here literally is what it is, Evan Hagolah, but it also could be the high place. And that's important because is it simply a stone that's at issue or a high place? As you can see from this image here, this is not a stone, but an elevated area in Gibeon that can look out across the plain toward Jerusalem. As we can see here in 21:6, just the next chapter, it's referred to the mountain of Yahweh, and that certainly is the hill I was just showing you. Perhaps the rock is something else, but we'll also hear in 1 Kings that Solomon goes to Gibeon to sacrifice, for that was the principal high place. Solomon used to offer 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. Notice he's not saying he's doing that now. It's suggesting the tradition of Solomon going to Gibeon to sacrifice as a high place. And so that may well be what's at issue here, that the large stone is simply another way to talk about it, or perhaps it's just simply a large stone. But the fact that they're in Gibeon recalls the battle at the pool in chapter 2:12, worth looking back at just for a moment in case that's not immediately on your mind, because it was a journey from Abner and the servants of Ishbaal, son of Saul, from Mahanaim to Gibeon, which is exactly where we're seeing here that we look from Mahanaim, where David was playing it safe until Absalom was gone, all the way back to Gilgal here and back to Gibeah. So that recalling that same journey, and there was Joab, son of Zeruiah, and the servants of David on one side, and Abner on the other side, and they all die. But that's certainly recalling that scene for our situation here. So Amasa came to meet them, and we have to consider literally to face him, as we see from the Hebrew. What is Amasa thinking here? So the way the story is presenting it, he's all by himself, facing Joab's men, the Cherethites, the Pelethites, and all the warriors. Can he possibly think they're coming to help him? Maybe they're thinking the king has sent out all these people to help him, but he certainly must know that the time for him to follow the king's orders to gather Judah has expired, whether he allowed it to expire and is refusing to collaborate, or whether some unknown obstacle got in the way, we can't know. And we can't know what Amasa's thinking, but it's not like he's thinking this is good, and yet he seems to go in completely naive. And the text shows us a detail that suggests that naivete is one reason why Joab can take advantage of him. So we'll stop right there in our verse, and we'll see next time what Joab does to make sure that Amasa is no longer the one to be pursuing Sheba. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.